Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. Sounds like folks are continuing to come in. My name is Corey Root. I'm the Homeless Programs Coordinator, and I work for the Orange County Partnership to End Homelessness. And I appreciate you being here today. So we're going to go through a couple of different sort of big chunks of stuff. First, we're going to start like really big picture, right? We're going to start at the top, like the 30,000 foot view, and talk about what the federal government says about homelessness and what research shows us about what works well in the systems for ending homelessness. Then we're going to like narrow it down a little bit more, and with that information, talk about what that looks like here in Orange County. Excuse me, and I'm just going to apologize. I'm fighting like a 6-week-long cold, so there'll be some coughing, I'm sorry to say, throughout this, but we'll muddle through. So the second part is like, so we know like these big picture stuff, what does that look like when the rubber meets the road here in Orange County? And then we'll get even more granular and look at the data and see what the data tells us about what the population of people experiencing homelessness in Orange County specifically looks like. So again, we're going to start like big picture stuff. And here's another acronym. The main piece of legislation that both funds and also sort of regulates what we do in homeless services is called the HEARTH Act. And this was signed in 2009 by President Obama. And this stands for the Homeless Emergency Assistance and Rapid Transition to Housing Act. So the Rapid Transition to Housing part is really new. Starting in 2009, and because of the way sort of things work and roll out and take to go through federal rulemaking processes and whatnot, this is still sort of new in 2017, the new part. So the emergency assistance part, we've been doing it for years, and the HEARTH Act replaced the McKinney-Vento Act, or amended the McKinney-Vento Act, which also governs sort of how the Department of Ed handles the homeless education liaison part of what they do in helping students who are experiencing homelessness. So that's a whole nother piece of it. So emergency assistance is really the question of where you're going to lay your head tonight, right? So that includes shelter, hotel, motel voucher programs and whatnot. But then the transition to housing, that's really another key part of what we are doing. Not to say that the emergency assistance part is not also a key part. We need both parts to have a functioning system. So that can sometimes be lost in the message for all the new part with the transition to housing. But both parts are very key and important in having a good system. So one thing that HEARTH did was create the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, or USICH. You can see we're going down the acronym road, right? So we're there. We're there right now. So there are 19 federal agencies that have lots of different things to do with homelessness. 5 of those are kind of the key partners. So the first is the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. They fund a lot of homeless assistance programs. We get about $700,000 here in Orange County that goes directly to agencies to fund homeless assistance projects. They also fund, housing authorities and Section 8 vouchers and things like that through different entitlement programs as well, HUD, CDBG, SBG, we get a lot of different acronyms there. So HUD does a lot of those things. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services also funds a street outreach program called PATH. They also obviously fund all the mental health, substance use treatment programs, things like that. The Department of Education, I was just mentioning, they have the Homeless Education Liaison Program. The Department of Labor, as we'll talk about, income is really a key to ending homelessness. So they have different job training programs, vocational rehab, things like that. And then the Department of Veterans Affairs. So veteran homelessness is a really key particular subgroup that we look at and are really tracking and looking to end homelessness for veterans. And the VA funds a lot of those programs directly for veterans and their families. So those 5 key agencies plus the other 14 agencies form the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness that really come together, look at all the research from around the country and different data, and say what's working best where are folks really moving the needle on ending homelessness, and how can we replicate that in other places all across the U.S.? So one way that they are giving us this information is through the federal strategic plan to end homelessness. So some of you guys might remember in the 90s and I'm not sure what we're calling that decade. Is it the OOs or the aughts or whatever that decade is? In both of those decades, there were a lot of 10-year plans to end homelessness. And in fact, we have one here in Orange County in 2007. We have the 10-year Orange County plan to end homelessness. So all across the country, folks came around the table, and this was a great thing that was really promoting the community-wide responsibility of ending homelessness, and recognizing we need a lot of different partners at the table if we're going to talk about ending homelessness. And I'll talk about exactly what that means in just a second. But one reason that we feel confident that we can end homelessness is because there was really a beginning to homelessness. So in the 80s, if we're backing up a little bit in our timeline, in the 80s, because of a number of different policy decisions made from people from all different parties across the aisle, there's no sort of one person to blame or one group of people to blame. It was a lot of different things having to do with defunding public housing in the 70s to deinstitutionalization in the 80s. A lot of things came, and then some pretty big economic crises on top of that. All of these things came together, and we really saw our first wave of large-scale homelessness in the United States. So the solution to that in the 80s was really building a lot of shelter. So when I said, we've been doing this HEA part of HEARTH for a long time, the Homeless Emergency Assistance, that's what I mean. In the 80s, 90s, you saw a lot of congregate shelters being built. We got to figure out a place for these folks to put their heads, right? The 90s saw, okay, let's get everyone together, these 10-year plans to end homelessness. And then in the 2000, HEARTH was signed in 2009, so starting in our teens decade now, we're really trying to use data and really evidence-based practices from all the folks doing things all across the United States to say, okay, what's working best, and let's implement these best practices as much as we can. So that's what Opening Doors is doing, and we are in the process with the Orange County Partnership to End Homelessness leadership team to update our plan to end homelessness, aligning with what we see in Opening Doors, which is the federal strategic plan to end homelessness. So I read a lot of policy documents and regulations, and they're not always super digestible, but I do highly recommend Opening Doors. It's very digestible. There's, citations and whatnot. It's about 60 pages long. There's a lot of pictures and pull-out quotes and stuff like that. And it has a good table of contents. So this is not like a super wonky document, but definitely a good place to start if you're looking at what, delving deeper into how we're going to end homelessness. And this document also sets some really ambitious goals for us. My background is not in services or in, mental health or things like that. I really depend on other folks around who have those types of backgrounds to help me. My background is in public administration. And when I read this document for the first time, I was like, oh my gosh, this is like a grad school, project. There's so many things that are just sort of public administration 101. They're looking at outcomes. They're setting measurable goals, things like that. And the measurable goal is broken down by different populations. So I was saying, veterans are a particular area for us that we're looking at. The goal was to end veteran homelessness by the end of 2016, all across the United States. And again, we'll talk about exactly what that means and what that looks like. And then to end chronic homelessness, so these are folks that have been homeless a long time or many times in a row and who have a disability, by also 2017. And then to end all homelessness for families and children and youth by 2020. So it's really setting these measurable, very ambitious goals. So we are not there yet, and a lot of folks aren't there yet, but we do have these goals, and we can see that other folks have done this and try to replicate what they've done here. So let's take a step back. So some questions that I get a lot, and you might start get a lot if you start getting sort of interested in this work and talking to folks about it and about homelessness. I get these kind of questions like at family reunions a lot, for example, and places like that, is sort of, why does someone become homeless? And what about the people who, quote unquote, choose to be homeless? So As far as why someone becomes homeless, there are as many different reasons as there are people experiencing homelessness, right? There's a lot of different systems that have failed that person. A lot of different. It's not like one thing that happened on one day and then, it just all went terrible. It's like a lot of things, multi-layered, many years, reasons of things that have happened. But the sort of model to think about, and you can apply this to sort of everyone experiencing homelessness, is that there was a certain amount of support in that person's life, and that support can take a lot of different forms, but there was that support, and then for whatever reason, that support was not adequate enough to keep that person from becoming homeless. So that support can take the form of, the military, if it's a veteran, and then that support is gone, and the veteran's there without support. The support can take the form of the foster care system. Someone ages out of the foster care system, that support's no longer there, and whatnot. The support can take the form of different relationships, financial, access to financial resources, et cetera, et cetera. And for whatever reason, that's not there. So, excuse me, cough, cough. I lost my train of thought for a second. So in thinking about that support and whatnot, people will unfortunately continue to become homeless because there will be crises that happen in people's lives, and the support may or may not be there. But that's sort of the overwhelming, the overarching model of why someone becomes homeless. And as far as why someone, quote unquote, chooses to become homeless, this is something we really hear HUD pushing back on pretty strongly, right? So, because someone is not choosing to go into a particular program or to live in a particular congregate shelter or whatnot does not necessarily mean the person is choosing homelessness. And in fact, what data show is that if you offer housing to folks, which we are starting to do and HUD really promotes doing, with very low barriers, no requirements that you have to go to this meeting or attend this prayer service or be sober even, very low barriers, then folks will choose housing every time. So HUD is really asking us to flip our system on its head and to say, if someone is not choosing to use your program, what's going on with your program? And if you have folks that are living unsheltered, what do you need to have in your system to address that, right? So it's not a matter of that our programs are the key thing. It's that we are trying to serve the people and get people into housing as quickly as possible. So how are we going to do that? What do we need to have in place on the ground? So when we talk about ending homelessness, so again, what does that look like specifically? There are three attributes to it that we want to have. We want it to be rare, brief, and non-recurring. So by rare, that means that if we can possibly prevent someone from becoming homeless, we will do that. And that is much better for like everyone, right? So it's quite traumatic to experience homelessness, and usually that means that you've already experienced quite a lot of trauma as well. So if we can prevent you from having to experience homelessness, we want to do that. It's also more cost efficient and everything else, right? So people tend to get in our system and get stuck in our system. And I'll talk about the traditional model of how we've served folks for a long time. So if we can prevent them, we want it to be rare. It's prevented whenever we can. We also want it to be brief, and by brief, the goals are very specific and very, very aggressive. So we talk about 30 days or 90 days. There are a couple of different definitions, but very as short as possible from the time someone becomes homeless, not until they're in shelter, but until they're in permanent housing. And when we talk about permanent housing, what that means is like I rent an apartment in Hillsborough. That's my permanent housing, right? My name is on a lease. There's no special provisions on that lease. I don't have to do anything to keep my lease other than pay rent and do what my landlord tells me to do, follow the things in the lease. But there's no special things beyond that. that. So that's what we mean, 30 to 90 days. So that's really, really aggressive. And then we also want it to be non-recurring. So if we are doing this amazing job in our system, we're getting folks into permanent housing just as quickly as we can, they're turning right back and coming back to our system after a couple of months or years. Again, that's a waste of resources. That's not working well for anyone. So we want folks to exit the homeless system and stay exited, maintain their housing. So, in order to have this in place, we need to have like a system, right? And have the system be working together, not just have it be sort of a series of programs that people like call this place or you go there and then you call the other one but it's really the system is working together. So someone enters the system and the system is all different parts of that system are taking care of that person and making and optimized to, get the person into permanent housing as quickly as possible. So that's what ending homelessness looks like. Again, unfortunately, it's not that no one will ever become homeless again. There will be crises. People continue to have crises in their life, like medical issues, right? The car breaks down, you lose your job, there's a weather event and your house gets ripped up. I mean, there's just stuff that happens all the time. And in that model, right, of the amount of support there for the person, it will happen again that for whatever reason that support's not there to prevent the person from becoming homeless. But we want to have the systemic response there that people can get back into permanent housing just as quickly as possible. So still thinking about the Hearth Act and how this is like, changing what we've done. So traditionally, what HUD looked at and how they measured this program, that program, the other program was just on your outputs, right? So this is like the public administration 101 stuff that I get like really excited about. So, the output is like, how many meals are you serving? How many beds do you have? How many nights were they filled? That's the output, right? Public administration stuff. The outcome is how long are people staying homeless? How many folks are exiting to permanent housing from your program versus how many folks are exiting to homelessness? How many people are exiting to permanent housing and then staying housed for 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 2 years, et cetera, et cetera. So these are the outcomes that we're looking at. So that's really the lens that HUD is putting on how homeless services are working. And also that the focus has changed from things at the program level and how your program is doing to the community level. So it used to be that Chelsea could have a program and I could have a program and they were right across the street from each other and she served single men and I served single men and no one else served women and no one else served families and that was fine. And HUD every year said, here's your money, Chelsea, here's your money, Corey, go to B, right? That was just how it worked. And now HUD is saying, wait a minute, what's going on with all the families in your system? What about the single women? Who's serving them? So that the lens is really changed from that program level to the community level. And that's also changing for funding, right? And how they're allocating funding. So that's a big change. And then the change we've already discussed from sheltering to also to housing. But that's not to say that shelter is not important. Shelter is very key to our system and we need them and we love them. So that's great. So when we talk about ending homelessness, again, both at the person level and at the system level, we need 3 things. And so it's like easy enough, right? We can all do this. It's great. So it's good that we know how to do it. So we need affordable housing, and that adjective affordable is there like super duper on purpose, right? So it's got to be affordable over the long term for you to maintain your housing. This is an issue for us in Orange County. Big time, right? So we're working on some different solutions to look at that and the Orange County Affordable Housing Coalition as well. So that's great. The second thing we need is services. And then this adjective appropriate is also there super duper on purpose. So the services really need to be individualized to the person. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but we used to have a really one size fits all for like what services the person needs. And now we're saying we're going to really individualize that. So the services that I need and the services that Jerry needs are going to look really different. Jerry's just a light touch case, right? He just needs a very small, just a couple of months of rental assistance, some case management. He's good to go. I have a lot of problems. Long-term services need rental assistance for a long time. So that can be really on a case-by-case basis. And then the person needs income. You got to have income to be able to maintain your housing. Kind of a no-brainer. So for some folks, that's going to mean a job, and for other folks, that's going to mean SSI, SSDI benefits. And I just got word today, actually, that we hired a SOAR caseworker. So there's a special program from the Social Security Administration that looks at getting people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness hooked up to SSI, SSDI benefits, the folks that have a disability and qualify for that, obviously, it uses a special method where folks can be fast-tracked to get these benefits, and the approval rate is like 3 months. And it's like they have like a 90% approval rating. So it's really exciting. So if you can get folks that income, that's the third key to maintaining the housing. And then we also need to have these things. So like each individual person needs to have these three things to end like their particular case of homelessness. But then at the system level, we need to have all of these things going as well. So we need to have like a pool of affordable housing, have that available for folks. We need to have our services, our service providers operating, in that manner where they're really customizing and able to do that based on their funding and the funding availability and all that kind of stuff. And then really good relationships with employers and SOAR caseworkers and things like that. So, okay. So I said what we used to do, and I'm so sorry for all this coughing, was do a really one-size-fits-all approach to, like, if someone was experiencing homelessness, here's what you do. So here's what that looked like. Traditionally, people go into a shelter, and you stay in a shelter for 3 months, 90 days. You go from the shelter to the transitional housing program. You stay there for 2 years. You can stay there up to 2 years. So at the end of 2 years and 3 months, you are still homeless. You're not in your permanent housing, like I have permanent housing, my name on the lease. You're still homeless, right? And if you've got kids, they've been homeless, they're in kindergarten, now they're going in 3rd grade, homeless, right? So that whole entire time. So what we're saying now is we really want to shorten that as much as we can. This method was actually pretty effective, right? There was like an 85% rate of folks transitioning at the end of that 2 years and 3 months into permanent housing. But you got to think about who's able to complete 2 years and 3 months in a congregate living situation. Is that going to be the folks that are super duper struggling with mental illness? Likely not. Is it going to be the folks that are, self-medicating with different substances? Not for many a shelter that I've visited where you are greeted at the door by a breathalyzer and, different other kinds of tests potentially. It's also super expensive, right? So it costs a lot of money per household, upwards of $20,000 plus dollars per household to do this for a 2 year, 3 month period. Excuse me. It also, so not everyone who's experiencing homelessness can do this type of program. So now what we said again is we really want to customize that approach. It allows us also to serve more people. So if we're not, using those resources in that cookie cutter way, we can potentially serve more people because some folks won't need as many services. It also, we're looking at prioritizing, and this again is sort of straight from HUD, the folks that are the most vulnerable. And this is like a huge change for service providers. So service providers have set up their programs, and I would do the same darn thing, you better believe, for who's easiest to serve for me, right? And who's working well with my program. What's the easiest thing for me to do with the easiest folks, right? So what we're saying now is we're really going to challenge ourselves to serve the folks that are the hardest to serve. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to give us a feel-good thing with every single client. Some folks are really, struggling with some tough stuff and a long history of trauma, and they're not, the warm and fuzzy folks. So regardless, the warm and fuzzy piece is not how the prioritization is going to happen. It's going to happen based on how vulnerable someone is. So these new approaches really look at getting folks into housing just as quickly as you possibly can. And then one thing that, again, sometimes is missed is not that the services then are like, whatever services. No, services are like super important, but the services are wrapped around the person in their housing. So this is sort of the difference between your school learning and your intern learning, right? So in school, you go in school, you take the notes, you're the professor. That's like my jam. If I won the lottery, I'd do that the rest of my life. Love me some school. But I do recognize that in the intern, when I did my internships, that was really a different type of learning. You are there, you're doing the work, you're learning the thing, not just in theory, but you're like doing it and you're getting feedback on it and that kind of thing. So it's a similar situation. So instead of like when you're in that 2-year-long program, the transitional housing program, you went to like some budgeting classes and some like parenting learning classes and some this classes and that classes. This, instead of like a budgeting class, you're with your case manager at your kitchen table doing your budget and talking about like, well, you're $50 short. Let's talk about that. What does that mean? Where did that money go? Et cetera, et cetera. It's just a different type of learning, and they found that it's really effective and can, again, be like done more quickly in a lot of cases. But this whole concept is called housing first, right? So we get people into housing first, the services wrap around them. But the whole goal is you get into permanent housing as quickly as possible. The traditional model that we used was called housing ready. So we're going to get you ready, quote unquote, ready for housing. And when you're ready, which takes a long time to get ready, right? Takes me a long time to get ready. Long time to get ready, then you get into your housing. But this is like the housing is first, the services wrap around you there right in your house. Okay, so if you're like, well, great, Corey, awesome. So if we know how to do all this, why have we not ended homelessness? Chip chop, let's get at it. So it's hard, right? It's pretty hard. There's a lot of things that need to happen as far as like getting folks, facing the same way and, looking at different lenses for what success means versus what we've done for years and years, 30, 40 years in your program that you've set up for all these times. So, a lot of folks talk about, the caterpillar. I talk with my son about, the hungry caterpillar and that kind of thing. And then the beautiful butterfly also. Those are two great concepts. So we don't think a lot about what happens in that change period in the chrysalis, and it's like super duper gruesome. There's like, the whole, everything like is dissolved and turned to goo and organs move around. I mean, it's like, it's rough what's happening in that change period. And that's the period we're entering in our system here, So it's hard work and it takes a lot of, community will and that kind of thing. So, but we'll get there. We will all be beautiful butterflies. But what we're looking to and what that beautiful butterfly land will consist of is that we'll have our system be able to solve two questions very quickly and very efficiently. Where am I going to sleep tonight if I'm experiencing homelessness? And then how am I going to end up permanent housing just as quickly as possible? Right? And so that immediate question, where am I going to sleep tonight, using best practices and things like that, that would also include a screen to see if there's any other safe place for that person to go. So this, again, is sort of a little bit counterintuitive. It's like, but no, we want everyone in our system. But in fact, if we can, again, keep people out of our system in a safe way. If it's not safe, obviously we want to get folks in our system and get them, to those appropriate resources. But if there's another safe place to stay, then we want to incorporate that. And then shelter, right? Hotel, motel vouchers, whatever. How to fix, someone's immediate situation. For the return to permanent housing, that can mean a lot of different things. And we want to, use like our Harry Potter sorting hat, right? And sort people to the right intervention for them. So for folks with not much, low needs, we want to just have them be able to have just light touch case management. For folks with a little more needs, like a rapid rehousing program, which has short-term rental assistance and case management associated with that. And then for folks who are like chronically homeless, right? The people that have been homeless for more than a year, more than 4 episodes in 3 years, long term, and who have a disability. Permanent supportive housing is often the thing that we're looking for there. So that's long term, often maybe for the rest of your life, rental assistance, and a high degree of services, high quality case management that's following up on you for a very, very long time, or maybe forever, depending on the person. Okay, so what that looks like going into practice. So we're going to talk about what our system looks like for folks who are presenting for services, and then for folks who are like not really presenting for services, because our system needs to incorporate everyone experiencing homelessness, whether they're looking for services or whether they are really burned out with the services and not so into that. So for someone who's presenting like for a shelter bed, what we want our shelters to be is a couple of different things. They need to be, this is like the best practice, Shangri-La butterfly world, right? So they need to be accessible, right, as much as possible. They need to be appealing. We're lucky here in Orange County. Our facilities are quite beautiful. Before I had this job, I worked in 79 rural counties in North Carolina. I've seen a lot of shelters. And there are some that are just, rough stuff. Not a place you'd want to spend the night or where your worst enemy to spend the night. Just really tough situations. So that's not okay either, right? It can't just be a place, where there's 30 people in a room with 6-foot ceilings and fluorescent lights and kids and, seniors and everything in between all in one room. That's not okay, right? It needs to be an appealing place that's okay. And then it needs to be housing focused. And so we want our whole system to really be thinking about that permanent housing question, even the shelter, right? So in the shelter and sort of best practices communities, they've got a stack of Craigslist ads for affordable places to rent on the table. The receptionist is like, "Good morning, how's your housing search going?" Your case manager says, "Good afternoon, how's your housing search going?" The guy who's, giving you dinner says, "Good evening, how's your housing search going?" Right? If you're not talking about housing, you're having the wrong conversation. So it's really, really housing focused and getting folks out of our system as quickly as possible. But then in between that, again, we'd have like a diversion screen. So if we can find another safe place for someone to be, they would be there, which is great. And then after someone's been in the shelter for a while, you'd have that sorting hat piece, right? You'd have systemized assessment and referral. So we're assessing people in the same way, using the same tool, right? So, unfortunately, in a lot of cases, again, not so much here and other places I've worked, if you come in on Monday, and you see Cindy, you might get like that referral. But then if it's like Josh, you'll like get this totally other referral, even though you have the same service need and blah, blah, blah. So we want to get rid of that sort of personality-based assessment and referral and use standardized tools. So that's also really clear and equitable for everyone of like, the reason you got this referral is because of this and that. And we can like point to that and it's really clear and understandable and transparent. So again, sort of public administration 101 stuff that gets me really excited. Excuse me. And then folks will be sorted to the right intervention for them based on what their vulnerability is. So then what about the folks who are not presenting for services? They're out camping, they're not asking for a shelter bed, not interested in going to the shelter. That's fine. In that case, we would have an outreach program that connects those people directly to the permanent housing staff. So it's not a matter of like, if you don't come into the shelter, we're like, whatever, and there's no. The connections are still being made. Folks are prioritized in the same way, using the same tools, et cetera, et cetera. But it's a little more customized to those folks rather than saying, well, just go to the shelter for services. Yeah?
What are some examples of prevention?
Yeah, so the question was examples of prevention and diversion. So this is just a screen that asks people and helps people think through any other safe option. So the questions are like, where'd you sleep last night? Why can't you sleep there again? What's going on? And then is there anything we could do to get you to go back there? Is there any other place you could sleep? Let's think about your coworkers, family members, et cetera, like just going through the options. So for me, I can say this is for sure true. When I'm in a crisis, I'm not necessarily like got my list and my highlighter out and like going through everything like very methodically and like in a real clear way. So all this does is like help people think through different options. It's not about sending folks, again, to any place that would be unsafe. And there are questions in there about, like, are you fleeing intimate partner violence or any sort of family violence? Worded in a less, like, jargony way, but asking those questions. And if so, it's like, stop, then it's referring to the good folks who do domestic violence work and who have skills in those areas. So it's not just like for everyone and everyone's treated equally, but it's like if there's any other place. And so what other communities have found is with like very small amounts of resources, and even in some cases with no resources, you can divert like up to 20% of folks from your system. So where were you staying last night? I stayed in my aunt's house. Why can't you stay there again? I was playing my music too loud. If we gave you a pair of headphones, could you go back there? Yes. Where are you sleeping? Friend's house. Why are you not there? I was using too much dish soap. This is an actual example from Charlotte. Diverted from entering the system with 3 bottles of dish soap. So, that is such a better way to do that than to bring the person into our system. Then that's a bed that's filled for the next person who has no other dish soap options, right? So if we can just prioritize those beds for folks that have no other options, that's what we want to do. And sometimes, again, with the no resources, it's just about conflict mediation. Where'd you sleep last night? I was at my mom's. We had a terrible fight. Can we get on the phone and talk through this and see what's going on and see if, we can get back there? So those are some of the examples. Okay. So that whole kit and caboodle, that soup to nuts, is what we call coordinated entry. And that's the like jargony, fancy thing that we talk about, like how people are entering and assessed and referred in our system. And so we are looking to implement coordinated entry in what a time that seemed like really far away. So it's February 2017 is when we're implementing that. So that's tomorrow. So anyway, we'll see how that goes. Yeah. Yeah, so the question was like about pipelines to homelessness. I'm just repeating for the microphone, and how we're looking at that. Yeah, really smart question, Jerry. So that's really key. So this is like why we want all the folks at the table that we possibly can, because again, if we can prevent folks from entering our system, we want to do that. And then if we can use other folks' money to do it as well, we want to do that as well, to stretch our small pot of money as far as it can go. So, for example, for folks, exiting correctional facilities, they have caseworkers there, that are looking for housing options for them. We want to partner as much as we can, excuse me, and try to, facilitate that process of, if we have units that we know about or things like that. Again, partnering with the foster care system and our friends at DSS and all of that. So it's partnering, and that's a lot of the reason why we have this really big tent approach to have as many folks at the table as possible. Yeah. Okay. So coordinated entry, there's some goals there with just really sort of standardizing what happens, systemizing it. So again, we've got all the pieces like working as a system. And then there's another piece. So we'll have data on all of that, which it's really exciting, guys. So we'll be able to look and say, like, okay, in the last month, in the last quarter, in the last year, we had this many people present. We would have made this many referrals to, rapid housing or permanent supportive housing if we had enough, resources available there. Instead, we had to do this thing, but we'll have real-time information in order to what they call right-size our system. So we'll know really very specifically what the demand is for every program and where folks are going and whatnot. So that's very, very exciting from my perspective at my level. So what we've had for a lot of years, again, are all these programs across the street from each other, whatnot. We've had a lot of clocks, and our system has looked like a clock shop. Right? So in some cases they were like clocks, and some were like a watch, and some were like a TV with a clock on it. There's like all different things in our system, supposedly a clock shop, but what we're building now is like one clock. Right? So all our programs and things need to work together, and we need to have each piece be like fully operational and working together. And then are the outcomes, to stretch the metaphor, that we're looking at, like the length of time homeless and all that. That's like the time, we want to be on time and, young lady, ahead of time. Yeah. So that's the goal of what we're doing with all this work with coordinated entry and whatnot. So that's the really big picture stuff.